Welcome to the ID 16.9 podcast, where we examine the ins and outs of legal identity and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 16.9 for legal identity for all, including birth registration, by 2030. I'm your producer and host, Frank Hersey. In this episode, we're exploring the goal itself and how it's been interpreted by international organisations, governments, the private sector, and even podcast hosts. Right back at the beginning of the series, we heard from Niall McCann, Policy Advisor and Programme Manager for Legal Identity at the UNDP, on some of the issues baked into the goal itself and how its progress is measured.
Looking back on it now, setting the indicator target as proportion of children under the age of 5 whose birth has been registered probably wasn't comprehensive enough to capture the complexity of this issue, because it just doesn't deal with adults who previously did not have legal identity, but now, because they've been registered in a digital ID scheme, do have legal identity.
We'll be covering these and a wide range of issues that led a group of more than 70 organisations and individuals, such as Access Now, Privacy International and Unwanted Witness, to write a joint letter to the World Bank, other international organisations and donor countries to, quote, cease activities that promote harmful models of digital identification systems. Joining me today is Tom Fisher, Senior Researcher at Privacy International, a human rights and surveillance advocacy organisation based in London. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
And so I thought we could get started with a bit of an introduction, a bit of a background on Privacy International and what it does and why identity is an issue for Privacy International.
Privacy International is basically a campaigning organisation that does advocacy and research on companies and governments who exploit our data and technologies, expose harm and abuses, mobilise allies globally, campaign with the public and more broadly with other groups, try and put pressure on companies and governments to change. We've been working on identities since the organisation was founded, with the UK ID system in the mid-2000s. Privacy International was one of the key organisations fighting, and eventually led to the defeat of that system and the deletion of the biometric database. Well, it's a perennial topic which really has emerged far more strongly in the last 6-7 years as an important one for concern. These new systems, particularly digital systems coming up around the world, Aadhaar in India being one of the leading examples, but also Kenya, the Huduma number system in the Philippines at the moment, and coming up in Mexico. Many countries have seen these kind of systems developing and the problems they cause, leading to issues of exclusion for populations, issues surrounding kind of insecurity these systems can bring, risks of data breaches, all these kind of things, and then the surveillance capabilities of these kind of systems. It's been a concern which civil society organisations all over the world, I think, are increasingly concerned with as they see it kind of impacting their own countries. These issues surrounding identity, identification, how that relates to things like Sustainable Development Goal 16.9, and some of the most powerful institutions in the world, the World Bank, United Nations agencies, hugely powerful private companies, the biometrics firms, the identity companies, and then on a national level, often pushed through at the highest kind of level, presidential politics pushing through these sets of systems, and various other organisations around ID for Africa, pushing for the development of certain technologies in the African context. It really is important to be critically examining what is happening in the world right now with this relentless push towards kind of these systems, often paying little regard to the actual human rights impact and the impacts to people on the ground.
Well, I think I'm going to play that back to people, because when I tell people that I do a podcast on legal identity, one of the first things I get asked is, there really enough to report on? Is there enough to do a podcast on this? And I then try and explain just how big a topic it is, and that you've rounded up many different aspects to it there. I suppose it was in that capacity that you wrote a blog piece, and this is going back 5 years now. No, sorry, this is going back 4 years now to 2018, when you wrote a blog piece for Privacy International about the SDGs, about SDG 16.9, the legal identity for all. So 2018 was, 3 years into the SDGs, because unfortunately the Millennium Development Goals hadn't managed to solve everything. We rolled into the Sustainable Development Goals. So I was just wondering what brought you at the time to write that blog piece?
I think looking at text of Sustainable Development Goal 16.9, by 2030 provide legal identity for all, including birth registration. The question is, what does legal identity mean? It didn't seem to us at all clear, no kind of agreed definition. But also it talked about birth registration.
Mm-hmm.
People are correct in saying it's hugely important and powerful for giving people access to essential services, leading to, it can be necessary for things like accessing education, health, employment, all these myriad of things that have been talked about in other episodes of this podcast. But what struck me is that despite the SDG only mentioning birth registration and the measure of that purely being about birth registration, then how this was being used and pushed by both a powerful institution of the World Bank, key proponents in this area, but also seemingly everyone who is kind of selling a digital identity product were using it to mean these kind of digital identity systems, usually biometric, more to do with ID cards or ID numbers linked to kind of centralized government databases a lot of the time. It was used as a way of kind of pushing and promoting these systems which have huge consequences for people's human rights and their lives, as opposed to birth registration. It just seems to me at the time that people were using this SDG for their own agendas rather than what it actually was. Now, this is largely because the term legal identity, no one really knew what it meant. There's all kinds of different interpretations there as to what it actually does mean. I think in the years since, we've got to more of an established kind of agreement surrounding of this.
Yes. So I was just wondering, do you have your own sort of understanding of what legal identity is, you or Privacy International, or is that not the point? Would that be the wrong thing to do? Would that be just yet another interpretation?
I think it's a term that has to be used sometimes with caution, because it's not necessarily clear always what it means. But I think it is entering more and more into kind of the discourse, so it's not a term that we avoided altogether. I'd put my emphasis on birth registration, civil registration, these aspects, leading from that things like death registration, which also, even if you could argue that other forms of identification tie into legal identity, if you want to argue that the kind of biometric ID system also gives people legal identity. The challenge is that those systems come with so many more concerns, so many more privacy concerns, so many more different elements to it, that I think we really do need to strip it back to, okay, let's look at birth registration alongside the other elements, registration of refugees, other elements going on. If we put our efforts that are being put into these kind of other biometric ID systems towards kind of the basics here of birth registration, I think we can make massive progress in that. And there's interesting and exciting ideas in that field which are kind of not necessarily followed up on. When birth registration linked to things like social security payments and things like that, how that can boost rates, how to do that in a decent way, how we can improve these kind of systems, and because identifying the weaknesses in these systems, that's hugely kind of important. But when the solutions to that become a biometric ID card for everyone, that just seems to me to kind of miss increase huge amounts of risks into the system, miss what's kind of important.
I was gonna say, I've got a clip here from Niall McCann, who was the former policy advisor and program manager for legal identity at the UNDP, because I spoke to him earlier in the series about what is legal identity, and just what you've been saying there about the maybe going back to the basics. I just thought I'd play this and see what you think of his summing up of what legal identity is?
Legal identity is the basic characteristics of a person, including date of birth, place of birth, name, sex, as recorded by a legal civil registration authority.
Okay, so that was Niall McCann with quite a simple look at legal identity and with the, I think, important element there of it being registered by the civil registration, a recognised entity in the country. Do you think that's a fair summing up, and do you think that's something that's a little bit lost at the moment?
Yes, I think it's about that kind of civil registration process. It's about those kind of the kind of birth certificate, or which will enable people to moving through their life to gain access to more and more kind of services and things. We start to think about what do we do about the people who haven't had their births registered,
Yes.
and should they necessarily be not able to access, say, healthcare or education for their children just because they haven't had their birth registered? That seems to me to be often not necessarily justified, and it leads to deeper exclusion for the people who haven't had their birth registered. There may be good reasons to have these kind of requirements in place, KYC for bank accounts, various forms of fraud you're looking to prevent. But you've also got to recognise that this brings with it a great deal of exclusion. Balancing up these needs, these factors, is kind of extremely important in making decisions whether you're going to require someone to have a birth certificate. Looking at the ID world more generally, there's this idea that the expansion of the uses of ID is inherently a good thing, that's pushing more people to need it is beneficial, whereas we'd say that just deepens the exclusion of those who don't have access.
Yeah, I was at the ID for Africa event in Marrakesh a couple of months ago in June, and in the main auditorium, somebody from HID, the private sector providers, Joby Matthew, he was addressing the auditorium of people from civil registries and ministries which represent ID from across Africa. And he asked the audience whether they agreed if, I think he said legitimate ID, whether they agreed if legitimate ID is needed to access public services. And I looked around and I'd say 80% of the people there put their hands up to say, yes, they think ID should be needed to access public services. And I know this is not a scientific way of doing things, somebody in a conference asking a question. But even so, I was surprised at the number of people putting up their hands. So it did feel a little bit there that things have moved on, that ID is for accessing services. It's not necessarily just about identifying yourself.
I mean, we've worked with organisations in Kenya working with people who, because they've been caught up on refugee databases, often through no fault of their own, they've ended up double registered and then unable to get Kenyan ID. And the amount of exclusion that they face, not able to access education, problems with healthcare, employment, even just travelling around the country becomes a huge challenge. We work with organisations who are getting these communities registered and jumping through the legal hoops. So I really think that this level of exclusion, when you know that there are communities and groups that have difficulty accessing this documentation, both for kind of reasons which poverty, it can be reasons of distance from centres, it can be reasons just simply bureaucratic problems, but it can also be kind of a political decision to exclude particular groups. That in the Kenyan case that went to court on the Huduma number, it was members of the Nubian community who had, despite being in Kenya for many, many, many decades, had a group which has trouble establishing themselves as Kenyan citizenship.
And it carries on from one generation to another. If you look at Kenya with the requirement for a birth certificate to attend school, if you're from one of these communities which is excluded and denied citizenship, then your children might not be able to be registered and might not be able to attend school. And in some ways it can just go on and on as ID systems are more strongly implemented.
I think though that the challenge is when we're tying everything back to one singular form of ID, that becomes a huge challenge, because in some contexts people have a multiplicity of identity documents, ways of proving who they are. They might have a driving license, might have maybe ID from educational establishment, all these different forms of establishing their identity. Yet when we begin to tie all of those back to one single source of truth, as it's put in places like Kenya, then it's tying everything back to that single not even document, but entry in a database. Now it's outside of the individual's control, and you don't have access to that one thing, then it's kind of serious consequences result, and that just kind of gives so much power both to the states, these kind of organizations. When we're talking about any of these topics to do with identity, birth registration, such like, we really have to think long term here, because these things are relevant for the entirety of people's lives, or even longer, as you said, about this intergenerational issues. And that's really a challenge, because you have to think about not only your government at the moment, about what they might do with this kind of with these kind of databases or this kind of power over, but also, do you trust your government 10 years from now? Do you trust your institutions to be able to protect you in those kind of contexts? This is why, particularly in kind of more fragile states, in these kind of contexts, then this kind of relentless push for these more invasive, more dangerous, to put it frankly, systems increases. Because I think one of the things that Niall went on to say in his podcast, I don't know if you want to add another clip, but is related to this acceptance that maybe if there is, say, a digital identity scheme and someone gets it later in life, that can still count as legal identity.
I do have that as a clip. On my hotkeys, should I play it?
Yes, yeah, go for it.
Okay, here we go. So this is Niall again. He uses India as his example.
If you're 35 years of age, you never had a birth certificate, but now you've been registered into a digital ID scheme like in the Aadhaar system in India. You've got an ID number. Your biometrics has been taken, so you can authenticate yourself and you can access public services. Well, then you have been granted legal identity, and yet under the strict definition of the indicator, i.e. proportion of children under the age of 5 whose birth is registered, you're not going to be captured.
Is that the point you meant?
Yes, yeah. I think what we have to remember is that they do different things, your birth certificates and, say, Aadhaar in India. Most notably, Aadhaar doesn't say anything about your nationality. It's available for legal residents, I should say, and citizens. Whereas documents like birth certificates can help establish your nationality. And I think we see this in a lot of different ways. They kind of lumping together all these different concepts and documents that perform different functions, things that Aadhaar card can do that a birth certificate can't as well. So lumping this all together within legal identity. Also, you've got to be aware that this is just a term that still brings together various concepts that perform different functions. And I mean, that's fair enough, because to an extent, because this, the SDGs were hard fought over to get to these kind of targets, these descriptions. But we've still got to remember they do different things. I'm concerned this is something the UN has moved away from and is going to lump together in the statistical gathering and just provide kind of a headline figure of legal identity, even though that hides a multitude of issues. And nationality gets into a position where you could have proof of legal identity but not of nationality, which is one of the major causes of exclusion, being stateless and these kind of issues. Such a massive issue which will affect every single aspect of your life. So lumping them all together under legal identity, that could be used to hide and to not reveal some kind of quite serious human rights risks there. So much of this falls on the UN to an extent, because that emphasis on birth registration far more than other organizations like the World Bank.
Yes.
I'd like to be sure that they really do emphasize that element rather than these other systems which come with so many different kind of human rights risks attached.
Yeah, I would say that the UN seems to have become more aware of the issues around the indicators it set for itself, and really the sort of looseness of the SDG 16.9 overall, and how useful it is. In some ways, it seems as though once it's gone out there, it's forked or developed in two different directions. There's this birth registration, which is maybe easier to measure, and that's what the SDG is. But then it's been reinterpreted by governments and the private sector and these large international organizations as being identity that you use as an adult to access services and do things. And it's almost as though the SDG itself created this vacuum for other people to fill and create their own interpretations. I mean, even I need to be careful sometimes when I'm discussing what legal identity is, because my way of thinking is that it's a way of being able to prove who you are at all. But looking at the SDG 16.9, is it just whether my birth was registered? So I think there's been this ongoing vacuum, really, which other people are jumping into.
With so many different actors in this space pushing their own kind of agendas, it leaves these kind of gaps in place. To give an example, one of the things we've seen, the development of problematic biometric ID schemes in Kenya and what they're developing now in Mexico, is that the argument made by governments and also World Bank is that weaknesses in birth registration need these biometric ID solutions, and that's a huge problematic leap in their thinking. This kind of logical leap, which very little evidence is presented for. It's very clear why weaknesses in birth registration can't then be dealt with in other ways, rather than necessarily making that move to biometric ID cards for everybody. It's still very much used as an argument, the need to deal with kind of birth registration issues. I think the problem to an extent is it's less sexy, it's less technologically advanced. I know there's lots of digital solutions, but a lot of it's going to come down to some often perhaps relatively mundane measures to improve and work on these kind of systems, as opposed to having this kind of solution to so many different problems presented in form of digital ID, which is presented as solving and being beneficial to measures across so many different aspects. Because when you see what the World Bank will emphasize is how meeting SDG 16.9 also benefits all these other SDGs, from maternal health, education, all these things, and how digital ID will benefit across kind of this range of SDGs, without looking into how it can harm progress in those areas by cutting off people's access to essential services, or leaving people stateless, or creating all these these additional problems. We lead to a kind of one-sided perspective where the pursuit of digital identity is only kind of developmental good, without exploring the harms, both kind of developmentally and from a human rights perspective.
I was wondering whether you might think, when SDG 16.9 was created, there was something of a lack of foresight with how technology would develop, or could it be that technology's developed so quickly in the meantime that it's become out of date? Or do you think that just the overall fundamental aim of 16.9 is still valid?
Looking with kind of hindsight, and I wasn't not necessarily familiar with, but perhaps for the benefit of hindsight, we should perhaps look more at kind of ID related harms, which goes kind of both ways, where people are excluded, but also what comes along with it, risks of insecurity, what happens when there's data breaches, all these kind of risks. I still think the organizations pushing for ID would have found other ways of doing it. Like there's a discourse now surrounding ID as a right, as a human right, which is also problematic in many respects. ID is very helpful in reality in accessing many rights, but making it a right in itself ignores that even the people without ID have the same rights as everyone else. Human rights apply to everybody, and making ID itself a right as opposed to just a kind of contingent tool to living in society is then used as an excuse for kind of rolling out more and more systems, but also expanding their scope to apply to more and more different aspects of people's lives. And to give another example, when COVID came along, completely unprecedented challenge, people working in the ID space suddenly found that, ID is a perfect solution to the challenges of COVID. also more specific to that, the particular ID system that their company or that they were fans of happened to be the perfect solution to this utterly unprecedented threat. Amazing coincidence that there's not enough kind of critical reflection on how what people have become fans of in terms of a system will then operate and work in different ways, and how it might work very well in some contexts but not in others, because the issues around the identity is such a huge range, diverse set of problems. Lumping them all together into one system, I think, is going to lead to issues, exclusions, it not working, it not being appropriate in that kind of context. So these kind of single solutions to the world problems connected to identity in some kind of ways, I think, is a cause of the kind of the challenges that we can just export these ideas to these other countries, and a system like MOSIP is appropriate in all these different contexts, which boils down to a failure to really articulate or establish what the problem is you are trying to solve with this kind of system. And then that leads to not establishing what the problem is, means that you can't analyze and look at whether the proposed ID card solution is the appropriate one for that problem. That current spread around the world, then there's all these kind of issues. There's an alternative universe where your podcast on legal identity is about what type of paper should we do is best to print a birth certificate on, or
can you print it at home?
How do various digital tools for birth registration work and operate? That's kind of what I wish so much more the focus was upon in that kind of debate, that kind of area. But because so many of these different concepts then get conflated into legal identity, it means that we've got to deal with a whole other set of issues as well around the biometrics, around how these things are stored, around exclusion, and all these sets of how these systems we use for surveillance as well, on top of all of that.
Data security, data privacy, of course.
So I appreciate the challenge of the podcast and the topic, but it's kind of how do we bring the world back and away from the risky, dangerous kind of all-inclusive systems that's is the current kind of norm towards a focus on basics to a large extent.
So those different strands, there's the government side of things, international organizations, private sector, development sector, I think they all come together quite nicely in what the World Bank sets out to do, because I think it would say that it is trying to promote all of those things in its promotion of ID systems. So just going back to the piece you wrote 4 years ago, where you actually looked into the World Bank, and then what's happened in the meantime? Because 4 years ago you were already questioning the World Bank projects and principles. I'm just wondering what has happened in the meantime.
Well, we've seen in that time more systems being introduced, paid for by the World Bank, or technically supported by them. In the Philippines, the rollouts of MOSIP-based system there. If you look at the contracts the government signed with the World Bank, then it's saying you've got to push this rollout, get it through, and also link your social security system to the system as a requirement for funding and things. But at the same time, we've seen an increasing kind of awareness and challenging of this kind of perspective by civil society organizations around the world. And we've seen more and more organizations beginning to come together and question why are these systems being forced on us where it's not benefiting our constituency. Maybe we're a excluded vulnerable group, but we're being required to use this. We have trouble accessing ID systems. How is this new biometric idea going to benefit us at all? Or elderly people whose fingers are worn and can't use fingerprint scanners, or trans people who just risk deepening exclusion from the expansion of these sets of systems. Once these systems kind of hit a country, then we see kind of the civil society developing these critiques, coming together to kind of to challenge. Very much in India, there's still active debates over Aadhaar. In Kenya, amazing breadth of knowledge and coming together from these groups. I was involved as an expert witness in the case that was brought to court by the Nubian Rights Forum, amongst others. And what really impressed me there is we've got these organisations really working from a grassroots level, recognising the challenges that these kind of systems will bring to them. And also generating that knowledge, that experience, those arguments surrounding these kinds of systems is fantastic, amazing knowledge that these groups and these people have to learn, remarkably quickly, because these are systems which are often introduced at speed. This bottom-up movement from civil society and the recognition that powerful organisations like the World Bank and their ID4D initiative, pushing so hard on this a lot of the time, funding it, giving that kind of technical advice, those setups and things, realising that it's not just at the national level, but at this international level, these kind of things need to be challenged. Recently, there was a open letter to the World Bank signed by more than 70 organisations from around the world, from I think every continent, beginning to challenge and critique the way in which these powerful organisations are behaving.
How did that come about then? Because Privacy International is one of the signatories on this letter of 70. And I mean, unfortunately, it seems that there's been more and more civil society organization activity around the world as more and more unfortunate ID systems are implemented and funded. So I was wondering how these organizations got together to draft and come up with this letter.
Well, Privacy International's own network of organizations that we've been working with for many years, funding in many cases, supporting their work, as well as other sets of other organizations around the world emerging from various sectors and networks, brought together very much by organizations like Namati, Privacy International, Access Now. We had been engaging with the World Bank over the last couple of years on some of the issues we began to raise and understand. We're involved with consultations with them on the principles for identification for sustainable development that the World Bank were leading in drafting.
And the World Bank is willing to engage, isn't it? It does.
The World Bank, to be fair, on ID4D, there has been engagement and meetings with civil society. I should be fair to compare to, for example, the UN Legal Identity Task Force had much less civil society engagement, almost none in its initial drafting and establishment. So there is a degree of listening from the World Bank. But I think we've reached a stage where we really need some kind of stronger change in approach, both how they work with engage with civil society, but also to really interrogate the things like the evidence base of why they are pushing for these particular models. Now, I know the World Bank would say that they are kind of more agnostic in what actual model is being pushed in all these contexts, and yet we see a great deal of similarity in what they are actually funding and offering technical support to. I know in the eyes of many across civil society, they're so strongly associated with kind of ADA-like models, and it's limited to the extent to which they have done anything to any other models of ID. There has been an extent of engagement, and obviously more engagement and conversations are always welcomed. How do we take this forward, and this kind of this push, as I say, emerging very much from organisations affected on the ground or fearing how a system will affect them? How do we then deepen the engagement with the World Bank? How do we bring about more change in the kind of the approach they take? How do we begin to get that appreciation of human rights more into the work of ID4D? With the best will in the world, World Bank focused on developmental issues rather than human rights issues, important difference from UN institutions. How do we begin to build an approach which appreciates kind of the risks and dangers and the problems that comes with these kind of systems, rather than this kind of relentless push and rollout around the world.
Was there any particular trigger for the letter being published now?
Well, there was some interesting reports coming out of the Digital Welfare State and Human Rights Group, and some excellent work there, through their own consultations with civil society, produced a quite hard-hitting report on the World Bank entitled The Digital Road to Hell,
Yes.
on how really getting to analyze what is happening and those kind of sets of problems and initiatives. So that was kind of a key, one of the key ways in which the authors of that report also reflected how civil society was talking about and analyzing and looking at the problems with this organization. And so that really formed the basis for much of the critique emerging in the open letter. And there's other sets of work are also important here. The Centre for International Society in India recently published a report on the spread of ADA around the world, looking at our influence systems in Kenya and Nigeria, in which the World Bank has played a key and powerful role, and all that kind of ongoing work. Analysis being done by the moment of Privacy International and our partners on systems in Mexico and the Philippines. I see it as increasingly, getting towards a crucial moment here in the development of this, because what I found remarkable talking to all these organizations around the world, they came independently to the conclusions around the risks, around the role of these powerful international organizations. That's kind of context where really risking the legitimacy of these identity systems if they're being introduced without much consideration of human rights, maybe playing some kind of lip service to a few issues, but basically forming huge risks. You're reducing trust, you're reducing legitimacy in these kind of models, these kind of ideas. It can be difficult working within civil society because the accusation is that we are just naysayers, that we are opposed to all the anti-ideal together, all these kind of allegations made. I've never met a single civil society organization of the hundreds I've talked with, engaged with, events with, who've said they're against ID, against any form of identification, against all these kind of things. I've spoken to many who are against a particular form, a particular system, a particular approach, how it's used, all these kind of issues. But together we can begin to build and look at and work on systems which deal with the genuine problems and difficulties that people face in their lives.
So what did these 70 sets of open-minded civil society organizations or individuals come together and ask for in this letter? I wondered if you could go through some of the demands, really.
The letter called for various more specific calls. There's a need really for an assessment, a rights-based assessment on what the World Bank's role is in supporting these kind of digital ID systems globally. It's been going on for several years now, since ADA has been around since 2009. These kind of sets of systems becoming more kind of mature, but understanding that evidence base of what's happening, those kind of looking at what the impact genuinely is hugely important, and that getting that evidence, getting that evidence base of the human rights violations, of what the impact genuinely has been of these systems on human rights. Because the challenge for civil society organizations, while we do work kind of looking into documenting many of these kind of abuses, we've not got the kind of scale, we've not got that kind of analysis to be able to really look at what is happening. Why is the World Bank? We really need to halt, give a pause, give the chance to look at both the funding, but also the kind of the advice and technical support offered by the World Bank and ID4D. What really is the impact of this? How can we have we assessed kind of linking these to social security? How are people excluded and failing to access often essential funds or goods which keeps them alive?
So I suppose it's a couple of things, really, isn't it? It's asking the World Bank to fund independent studies, assessments of its own work, but for it to be independent, not doing it on itself, and then to pause any further investment or rolling out new ID systems in the meantime.
And I think alongside that, we need to get greater transparency about the activities of the World Bank surrounding digital ID, the kind of what are they doing with their client governments. Because we have kind of frameworks like the Principle on Identification for Sustainable Development, but we don't really know in any way how that's used or enforced, or how that kind of, what circumstances are there red lines drawn surrounding breaches of that. So we don't have that transparency about how they're actually kind of operating. And I think having that transparency is beneficial for all parties involved, because if the civil society understands better what the measures the World Bank is taking, then that's good not only for civil society but also for the World Bank. It's not about making the World Bank into an enemy here. It's not got those kind of motivations. It's about understanding creating a future where civil society, who've got that amazing knowledge about what is happening on the ground, that analysis of how these systems affect people, who are so often excluded from these processes or only kind of partially involved in a relatively minor way, bringing them into the heart of these processes.
There is some sort of momentum being generated now and a more powerful voice to direct at organizations. I think it's probably worth noting that the letter isn't just to the World Bank, it's to other organizations as well. I think primarily the World Bank, but it does mention the UN and even donor countries such as France, the UK, Australia.
Yeah, I think it's notable that, we have these key kind of funders, organisations like the UK's funding of ID4D, when the UK itself rejected any form of biometric identity card for its own citizens, now willing to fund them around the world. Similarly with Australia. But those key funders, there are many other actors other than the World Bank involved in this, because they've set themselves up, both they're powerful funders, they're also got the kind of technical advice and guidance, setting themselves up as experts and the wealth of information they put out there. And then the behind the scenes work they do with governments, one of the key places where there's that lack of transparency. They've been identified again and again as kind of a key source of both funding or part of the drive for particular things. And they're hugely influential on other organisations like ID for Africa and their work pushing out these systems in the African context. There are other kind of groups, coalitions, also in the identity space, ID 2020, as well as those pushing more kind of self-sovereign identity, blockchain-based problems, blockchain-based solutions, and all these kind of other models out there, which equally need to be critiqued. I don't think we should necessarily think that the World Bank is the sole organisation to influence here, but they are key and probably the most important one in the world. So this is why it's identified as a target for this particular bit of advocacy.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting timeline here in a way, because the blog that we were talking about before that you wrote in 2018 addressing many of these issues, seems like in the meantime they've intensified, more money has poured in. And so 2022, there's this letter from all these organizations in the world with a 2023 deadline. I just wondered how you see the whole sector progressing. Do you think it's going to be accelerating? Do you think there could be any brakes applied in the foreseeable future?
It's a challenging question, because all we can do in civil society is keep trying our best to influence things however we can. On the negative side, then a lot of the debate has become increasingly polarized. And I think that's dangerous, because nobody's listening to each other.
Yes.
And it can be quite toxic. And it's a challenge when they think that civil society is anti all forms of ID, for instance, and those kind of discourses. On the more positive side of things, when I see what partners in Kenya or Uganda or all these kind of countries which are facing these challenges, the quality of the knowledge, the quality of the experience, the debate, what they are doing, then that is reason for hope for coming up with solutions, coming up with answers to these kind of sets of problems. I think we need to move away from the kind of toxic discourse. And I know that some listeners will think that organisations like Privacy International have been part of that, just from highlighting risks and dangers. But you have to look at what we face when there is a relentless kind of positivity and ignoring of these kind of sets of risks and dangers and the negative effects.
Yes, and I do think that the way that so many parts of life are moving online, controlled by apps, managed on our phones, on our computers, I can see that it will become hard to resist introducing digital ID systems and then the whole system just snowballing from that sense. And I do wonder if in the future, with the UN's SDGs and 16.9 in particular, creating a sort of demand for ID, creating this goal, and then various organizations in the private sector really getting stuck in. I wonder if it's going to just evolve into something quite different from what was set out, and whether at any point in the future we might look back and wonder whether this was allowed or sanctioned by the SDG at the beginning. Do you think that could be a possibility?
I think this rollout of kind of this requirement for either giving an identity or kind of verified attributes within kind of various other digital ID systems, I think that's a big concern that's not being addressed. We design these systems, for instance, in the UK, currently working on the trust framework. There's been a lot of engagement with civil society on that, I should say. We're still not really kind of quite addressing that risk of so that you need more and more uses for your digital ID, which isn't necessarily good for privacy, but also inclusion,
surveillance.
Those kind of risks, losing that ability to type in a fake name when you're on a Wi-Fi in a cafe, or losing so much from that change to the digital, whereas there's times where you had to show your ID or ID card or your passport or whatever. When you were showing that to someone, to a security guard that glanced at it, checked the photo, that's okay. Noticing the change there in the digital realm where this information is stored, processed, analysed, used to track all these kind of issues. And that, as you say, that push for its use in more and more different contexts is something that we haven't addressed. And how we begin to halt that. There are ways. I know in Singapore, then there's restrictions on what companies can store your ID number, things like that. So there are ways to do it through various ways. But you've also got to remember that you've got a fundamental power relationship there. Whenever you're asked for your ID, that person has kind of power over you, whether it's a security guard preventing your access to a building, a police officer, the government asking it to give information to access services, all these kind of things, that there is that central power relationship there. And that's something which really puts kind of many of the current digital ID solutions, so much rests upon the individual and supposed consent to the sharing of information and things like that. I think that doesn't take into account those kind of sets of power relations inherent within things like ID checks. That's a major issue and challenges, and things which I think we've been slow in addressing with so much technological development in this sector, both in biometrics, but also in kind of various forms of identity. There's still these kind of essential problems that align there, and that's getting towards some kind of solution there, which is both from the technology, also regulation, all these kind of sets of issues, preventing kind of the function creep, the expansion, the needing it for more and more things, which is in kind of the nature of ID systems to be used for more and more different things. In many countries and contexts, that's by design, because you need that private sector use to fund the system in the first place. You want government departments to make use of it. I think that is a major challenge across the future.
Yeah, the messaging is that it has to be unique at all points. ID has to be unique, and the only way to ensure that is via biometrics. That seems to be the message promoted in Africa.
Uniqueness is a challenging concept, whether it's linked to biometrics or not. Obviously, more so when there's biometrics involved, because for a lot of uses of ID, it doesn't necessarily need to be unique. If I want to establish my nationality, I've got my passport, I've got other documents, but other forms of proof. I might get signed testimony from people who've known me for a long time. These kind of things. Establishing uniqueness there isn't necessarily the key point. Similarly, with financial inclusion, opening bank accounts, it doesn't necessarily need to be unique in all these kind of different contexts. Having these kind of unique identities, I can't create my own. I've left myself open to so much more intrusive tracking of me and profiling once everything is linked back to this single piece of paper or single entry in a database. Whether you need uniqueness in a particular ID system depends entirely on what you are using it for. On top of that, with the move to biometrics to us being kind of the only way of establishing uniqueness, that also needs to be kind of critiqued because of the human rights concerns. For any kind of technology like that, has to be necessary and proportionate to the lawful purpose, basically. So again, purpose, why are you doing this? But also, are there other ways of deduplication? Are there other ways of establishing these kind of things? You've got to look at the evidence about why you can't use things before you immediately go to the more kind of intrusive and dangerous and risky technology. I just don't see that being done. I don't see that question of this evidence and other ways in which we can begin to look at this. The other side of that is we have these kind of issues preventing people accessing, say, government services that identity places in their way. Can we remove those barriers altogether? Or can we lessen those barriers in other ways without introducing an ID card? Can we reform what documents people need to open a bank account, say? If that's our goal of financial inclusion, then, okay, what ways can we streamline that process? Okay, we need people to have ID, school children to use biometrics to go to school to prevent fraud in the school system. Okay, well, what other ways can we do that without ID? And just simply the quantification of the problem a lot of times is completely lacking. Okay, we want to prevent foreign citizens from using our hospitals. Okay, how big is that problem? To what extent is it there? How much is that costing us? What risks are we introducing by introducing these kind of systems?
So what sorts of messaging helps win an election, though?
I think the challenge is that saying this big shiny idea of the kind of ID, digital ID, being the solution to everything, which as opposed to the kind of the tricky, dirty, complex, there not being one solution to so much of society's ills, it's not going to help matters. I can kind of see why the appeal, if you have this one solution which is amazing and fantastic and will be a solution to so many different problems, as opposed to the kind of complex reality where it's looking more at how kind of the reality of how these institutions work and operate, and then how we can solve these problems without ID, how we can perhaps use more forms of ID, open things up more in those countries where people have a wallet full of different cards. Why are we introducing another one to kind of form and link together all the others, as opposed to using what people have, where they come from? But then also, how do we make use of forms of ID that emerge from the community to establish someone's identity, things like vouching and other ways forward before we leap to this singular solution. We had to present one model which is perfect. I mean, I can kind of see an appeal there for something that you can do and you can stand up and do your TED talk about, as opposed to the reality of getting hands dirty on the ground. But then that's why we have civil society organisations who are there with the community and emerging from the community and working with the community, who understand these problems and can begin to develop those solutions.
Well, thank you so much. We've covered so many topics there, with legal identity, biometrics, digital identity, possibly not needing identity. It's been interesting to look at the role of civil society there and how there is something of a consensus building around some of the issues around identity, and some hope, I think, in terms of some momentum growing. And it'll be interesting to see what happens if you get to respond from the World Bank. I know we're hoping to speak to the World Bank on their projects more generally, and it'll be interesting to hear about their thoughts on the letter that they have received. But thank you so much for spending the time to talk about these things and Privacy International's viewpoint on these things. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Tom Fisher, Senior Researcher at Privacy International. We're expecting to hear from ID4D and the World Bank very soon on their projects and approach. In our discussions with ID4D so far, their team have raised a few issues that they want to bring clarity on. The World Bank is not providing technical assistance nor financing specifically for Kenya's National Integrated Identity Management System, which operates the Huduma number system, against which Tom Fisher is an expert witness. Previous World Bank funding and assistance was for strengthening Kenya's civil registration and vital statistics. They also point out that in the Philippines, while they are providing funding and technical assistance for the Philippines Identification System, or PhilSys, they are not requiring a link with that system to the welfare system. The Philippine Department of Social Welfare Development has initiated a pilot with PhilSys that recognises PhilID as an ID for beneficiaries, among other credentials, something the World Bank noted as a good reform. We hope to bring you an episode with the team soon on what they've been doing and what they've not been doing. In the meantime, to find out more about legal identity, the UN goals, and to listen to all our episodes and get the transcripts, go to id169.com and see if you think we're on track for 2030.